Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for following and supporting the work of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development, Southeast Europe's leading foreign policy think tank. We are continuing with our Corona dialogues, where we're trying to bring from various parts of the world leading world's thinkers on foreign affairs, on global economy, and all other fields. There is no doubt that the two most powerful militaries in the history of mankind are those of the United States and the Russian Federation. However, both of these countries seem to be struggling today in a fight against an enemy that cannot be defeated by nuclear arsenals, submarines, or supersonic jets. Will the COVID-19 crisis bring an end to a world order that was put into existence by Russia and America at the end of the Second World War? Is this crisis going to change the way that Russia and America perceive the world and interact with each other and the rest of the planet? Are they worried about China? What is going to happen in the Russia, China, America triangle, and what is to be expected by the rest of the world? Well, answers to this and many other questions are going to be given to us tonight by two exceptional experts and good friends of mine. The first is Richard Fontaine. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for New American Security, one of the leading think tanks of Washington, D.C. He was the chief foreign policy advisor to late Senator John McCain and also served in senior positions in the White House, the State Department, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He is also the executive director of the Trilateral Commission and also teaches at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Washington, D.C. My second guest tonight is Andrey Kortunov, the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, the leading think tank of the Russian Federation. Andrey Kortunov is a graduate of the Moscow State Institute of International Relations and the Institute for U.S. and Canada Studies of the Soviet Union Academy of Sciences. He served in Soviet embassies in Washington and London, as well as the permanent representation to the United Nations. He taught at universities both in Russia and around the world, including the University of California at Berkeley. Gentlemen, it is an exceptional honor to have you with us again. We were also privileged to host you physically in Belgrade in the last few years, but the world of today is very different. So I am wishing you a warm virtual welcome to Belgrade this evening. I'm going to start with asking you a very simple question, both of you. First, Richard, and then Andrey. Why is it that with all this wealth spent in the defense of your respective countries, America spending about $720 billion a year, Russia spending 68 or 69 billion, that's less, but that's a lot of money too. Like, how is it that the two most powerful countries in the world seem to be struggling so much with this crisis, much more than a number of other countries around the world? Richard, you go first.
Well, thanks, Vuk, for having both of us. And I look forward to returning to Belgrade in person, not just virtually, at some point. And perhaps Andrey and I and you can reprise this when things get back to a little bit more normal. So it's been a while since I've been in Belgrade, and I miss it. It's a complicated question that you ask, right? Because on the one hand, the amount of spending that goes into the U.S. defense budget, like you said, is more than $700 billion. That is directed at national security threats, not primarily at health-related threats or other transnational threats like global warming, for example, and things like that. So there's the question about how does the country going forward rack and stack the threats to the country? Do Americans start to see pandemic disease or maybe other transnational issues as more threatening than terrorism or China or some of the other things that are currently prioritized? That, I think, is a question that sort of remains to be resolved. The other part, though, is why have we gotten to the point where we are? And I think there's, again, a couple of reasons for this. One, in the United States, is that the government, both at the state and federal levels, were clearly unprepared for a pandemic that would move with this speed and affect this number of people this quickly, particularly something brand new for which no one has immunity. There was some technical problems. The initial set of tests that the Centers for Disease Control had just didn't work, which is a pretty terrible time to have tests that didn't work in the first batch. And then you have had a real difference between the 50 governors and what they're doing at the state levels, and a sort of patchwork of different regulations and requirements, and what's happening at the federal level as they've tried to sort of gear things up. And I'm afraid that when you add all those things together, what you see is a pretty tough picture like the one that you see today.
Well, thank you, Richard. Andrey.
Well, first of all, if you ask this question, President Putin, I'm sure that President Putin would tell you that in relative terms, Russia is doing pretty good. If you look at the number of infected, it's much lower than in major European states like France or Italy or the United Kingdom or Germany. And if you look at the mortality rate, again, it is pretty low for the time being. It's less than 1%. We don't know whether this statistics remains the same in a week or in 2 weeks from now. Maybe Russia is still catching up. But so far, the situation here is much less dramatic than it is in many European countries. However, I think that your question is valid. And my general reply to this question is that we, not just in Russia, but I think all over the place, inherited the old perceptions of national security, and the budget priorities reflect the perceptions of the previous century. Indeed, we are still, or rather they are still in the world which is dominated by nuclear weapons. And the perception is that the more we invest into hardware and software, the more secure we are. And when they don't know what to do, they do what they know. There is an old culture, there is a lot of inertia, there are bureaucratic interests behind the old pattern of defense spending. And I think it is extremely difficult to change the momentum and to change the system of priorities that will be reflected in the budgets. I think that hopefully the current pandemic will somehow force state leaders to reconsider their priorities, but so far we don't see it.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to ask you about the impact of this crisis on your respective domestic affairs, first and foremost. Do you expect, Richard, that America is going to be the same after this is over? Well, probably not. Nothing is ever the same after a dramatic development. But how do you think? What do you think are going to be the main differences between America before and America after the COVID crisis, and in particular when it comes to politics? At least for now, it seems to be even more polarizing than it was before the crisis. And who do you think at this stage looks like it's going to be a bigger beneficiary politically of this crisis, relatively speaking, of course, Donald Trump or Joe Biden?
I wish I had my crystal ball with me. Most of us since 2016 who've had crystal balls in politics found them broken by how unpredictable politics has been in the United States. I think there's a few things that are going to be different going forward. So one is just what we were talking about. If you look at the polls today compared to the polls, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago, if you asked Americans, rank your top threats, national security threats to the country, they would list terrorism, they list global warming, they list cyber attacks, they would list China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, all of these things. Now, not surprisingly, pandemic disease is number one. Will that last? It's hard to say, but it's certainly on the radar screen and therefore will have a political salience in a way that it didn't before. Secondly, the United States is going to borrow something on the order of $3 trillion this year, and the numbers are still going up. The Congress has come together to sort of conjure dollars out of the air and pass these gigantic spending bills. But of course, it's all borrowed money, and that will put downward pressure on other things like the defense budget, like other spending priorities as we get a couple of years out. It's hard to say actually that the crisis has polarized things even more, because we were pretty damn polarized going into the crisis. And in fact, with the backs against the wall, you did see Trump and the Democrats and the Republicans come together behind these spending packages and things like that otherwise would not have ever even been thinkable. That said, it's hard to know who benefits the most right now. We've got an election coming up in November, but it's only April. And so I can paint you a picture where Donald Trump by the fall says, I vanquished coronavirus, I vanquished impeachment, I vanquished everything they threw at me. And, our economy is getting back on track, and give me another 4 years. Don't, risk it with this other guy. I can also paint you a picture where, there's still openings and closings, and the coronavirus is still going, and the government is still struggling to respond. And this sort of benefits, Biden rather than Trump, just if for no other reason than he's the opponent. And everything will turn on what conditions look like come September, October. So, and that, it's just impossible to say.
Well, thank you for that. And Andrey, Russia's domestic situation also seems to be complicated. Well, at least from the economic perspective, it's a more challenging situation. America can borrow trillions of dollars. America can print dollars. America is much bigger economy. What was particularly unfortunate, one would say, for Russia is that this pandemic coincided with the collapse in the oil prices, and we all know how important oil and gas prices are for the Russian economy. Now, with this global slowdown and possibly global depression, the price of oil isn't very likely to grow substantially in the coming years. That is a problem for the Russian budget and the Russian economy. Also, Vladimir Putin is usually admired even by those who are not supportive of his policies as a master tactician when it comes to both domestic and international politics. But this time around, with the COVID-19, he seemed to have scrambled a little bit with the change of the constitution, the announcement that this was going to go ahead, and then there were changes in the way this was done, and finally it was postponed, the referendum on the constitution. Now, what do you think is going to be the impact on the domestic affairs, both economically and politically, of the COVID-19 crisis under the circumstances?
Well, Vuk, I think that you are right, and as we know from the experience of the previous cyclical crisis, emerging economies are usually hit harder than developed economies. And of course, for Russia, the collapse of oil prices is arguably even a more serious problem than the pandemic itself. Indeed, the country has accumulated a lot of reserves, and it can live on these reserves for a couple of years. We don't know exactly how long we can stretch these reserves for, but definitely there is a certain margin of safety even now. But at the same time, the situation is getting definitely much more complicated than it was a couple of months ago. The good news for Mr. Putin is that under the current circumstances, he can probably default on his previous promises and his commitments. He can now say, okay, we cannot really have a serious increase in living standards because of these dramatic developments. So trust me, it will take more time, but we will get there. And another advantage that he can get out of the situation is that, of course, right now nobody would ask for demonstrations or rallies in the center of Moscow. Definitely everyone understands that it's not going to have, so the opposition will be deprived of the opportunities to make a case. However, I think it's a gamble for the president because he has to demonstrate that he can deliver, that he can handle the crisis better than his adversaries in the West, that Russia is in a position to demonstrate some comparative advantages in dealing with the crisis. But what I can tell you for sure is that the country is likely to be more inward focused after the pandemic. So earlier, we had the so-called Crimea consensus, which meant that the leadership couldn't provide for high economic growth, but instead it could compensate for relatively poor economic performance by demonstrating very active, very energetic, not to use a different word, foreign policy. And this sense of great power status for some time was a compensation for the economic stagnation. I'm not sure that it will be the case right now. I think that Russians are changing their priorities. They are much more concerned about their day-to-day lives. So one can argue that the pandemic has become the last nail in the coffin of the Crimea consensus. And we don't know whether this Crimea consensus can be replaced by a Corona consensus. It might happen if Putin shows a lot of efficiency and if he can sell his approach to the pandemic to the public. But so far, his popularity is going down. So I'm not sure that we have the rallying around the flag phenomenon in Russia these days. At least I don't see it.
Well, that's very interesting. What you said, I picked on one thing that you expect Russia to be more inward looking after this crisis. Uh, well, Richard, America has definitely been more inward looking, not just since the COVID-19 crisis, but we're talking about this phenomenon certainly since the Trump. This is the beginning of the Trump presidency. So my next question to you guys is going to be about what will be left of the international order that existed uh, after this is over. I served in the UN. I was president of the UN General Assembly, and I can attest to you firsthand that the two countries that mattered most in the United Nations were United States and Russia. And yes, you had other permanent members of the Security Council, and yes, Russia was perhaps not the most powerful economy in the world, but when it came to the UN, it was Moscow and Washington that mattered most. It seems to me like it cannot be avoided to point a finger at Moscow and Washington when it comes to why did UN become so dysfunctional. But it wasn't only the UN that became dysfunctional. We saw that the G20 has hardly come to any conclusion in the midst of this crisis. G7 is not doing much better. There seems to be like a big geopolitical recession that my friend Ian Bremmer likes to call that there is a withdrawal of international actors from the international scene, and that multilateralism is one of the victims of the current development. So my question first to you, Richard. America is still the strongest country in the world. It's going to remain the strongest country in the world for quite a while. How do you see America's positioning with regard to the global scene after this crisis, and what are going to be the contours of the new international order, if any, after COVID?
Well, certainly the institutions are going to stay put. I mean, the UN isn't going anywhere. The WTO is not going anywhere. The various multilateral institutions, I think, will remain, and and certainly the underlying rules of the road will stay in place, whether it's the maritime rules or non-proliferation regimes or whatever. I think the
Including
question.
WHO?
I think the WHO will still be there. What the U.S. relationship with the WHO is, I think, it remains to be seen, shall we say. But look, I think that the question that you're getting at is, it's great to have those institutions there, but how effective are they going to be in actually doing anything? Ultimately, this is about outcomes, not process, right? And here, it's really striking to me that the spread of a global virus should be the paradigmatic example of the kind of thing that bring countries together, right? No one has an interest in the virus spreading. No, everybody is threatened by this to some degree. It is not. Well, none of us is safe until it's contained everywhere, right? We can't just sort of have a fortress America or a fortress Russia or a fortress China or a fortress anything else. And of course, the United States has been in a withdrawal is probably too strong a term, but a more limited international role mood going back into the Obama administration, where President Obama talked about the need to for nation building at home rather than places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and then President Trump is manifestly accelerated that process. But the striking thing to me is that there's two things I would say. One, that it's not just a Trump America first kind of thing that you see today. Germany lives in a common market, but it closed its borders and prohibited the export of medical equipment even to other countries in the EU. France did the same kind of thing. The United States and Canada barely coordinated when they put into place travel restrictions and things like this. It's been this kind of every country for itself response to something that you can tell another story about how it demands an international cooperative kind of framework. The second point that has been striking to me is, in the kind of foreign policy field, we often wonder, well, okay, if the United States really stepped back and didn't set the agenda in some of these places, and I leave out the UN Security Council a bit, because whenever there's been tension between Washington and Moscow, then the UN Security Council gets paralyzed, and we saw this for decades during the Cold War, and I think we're seeing that again today. But some of these other ones that don't rely on, on vetoes and things like that, the United States often will go in and try to set an agenda and work with other countries. And in the absence of that, which I think we're seeing an absence of that today, who fills in the blank? And it's not the case that Emmanuel Macron fills in that leadership role in the G7 as much as he might like to, or Germany, or in the G20. It's not China or Russia that it fills in that role. That no one fills it. And so what you see come out of these bodies after these summits is these grand pronouncements about cooperation in the abstract, but zero in the way of time-bound specific commitments for what countries are going to do together. So one of the things that I take away from this is, at least right now, in the absence of some American leadership in these areas, you don't get leadership by anybody.
Andrey, I read a few days ago, former Russian Foreign Minister Ivanov came out with an article on the future of the international order, and he mentioned the meeting of the Allies at the end of the Second World War at Dumbarton Oaks in 1944, when they debated as to what should they do after the defeat of Nazi Germany, and there came the idea of the San Francisco meeting and the San Francisco Charter leading to the establishment of the United Nations. Now, like Richard said, this is the opportunity to pull a brake on certain developments and rivalries from before. It was a virus that attacked everybody. Tomorrow there can be another virus. Tomorrow there can be something else from the nature that hits us, related or not so directly related to climate change. But certainly this is continuing to be a shock for the way that the world functions. Now, do you see a chance, and Russia is a very important stakeholder in this as a permanent member of the Security Council and the second most powerful military in the world. Do you see a possibility for a second Dumbarton Oaks and the outline of a new world order based more on cooperation and less on competition? Or is this just a dream of a multilateralist like I am?
Well, first of all, let me say that as far as I can see, the paradigm of thinking in the Kremlin, it's very Westphalian. And the crisis, to some extent, serves very well the narrative that they have in the Russian leadership. They can now say, we told you that states are the only important players in the international system. We told you that sovereignty is really of paramount importance. We told you that multilateralism is not for real, and that your principles of solidarity are hypocritical. And now, basically, you see what's going on. So, in a sense, this crisis serves the worldview that we have in the Russian leadership. But having said that, I also believe that the Russian leadership would love to have a P5 meeting and to discuss a new world order. But their perception of the new world order is that it's not really about multilateralism, it's about multipolarity. It's that big guys are sitting around the table and they decide on the future of the world, like they did in 1945. The difference between the two situations is that the world was different. And right now, you cannot simply impose your will on smaller nations. You cannot impose your will on non-state actors. So it's very difficult to get back to where we were in 1945. And I think that what's going on in the world right now, and I think it's very unfortunate, is that we are moving to a new bipolarity, which will be a US-Chinese bipolarity. And you mentioned the United Nations Security Council. I think one of the reasons why the United Nations Security Council failed to pass a resolution on the pandemic, unlike it was the case with Ebola or HIV/AIDS before, is that because China and the United States could not agree on the wording of the resolution. China would like to put the United States accountable for unilateralism. The United States wants China to take responsibility for the beginning of the crisis, and here we are. I think in the end of the day, nobody will benefit from this bipolarity, and clearly Russia will not benefit because in the bipolar system, it will have to stick closer to China. It will have to lose a degree of its autonomy in foreign policy, and it might lose a number of its important partners, especially in Asia. But that's the direction in which we are moving right now. I hope that we can reverse it, and I hope that maybe in fall, the permanent members of the Security Council will get together, maybe on the margins of the General Assembly, and decide on how they're going to act together. But unfortunately, the pandemic does not seem to be strong enough a shock to change the mentality of the leaders. And that's, in my view, is not only unfortunate, but that's deplorable.
Well, okay, since there doesn't seem to be too much hope for a new multilateral beginning, let me be more Westphalian in the next round of questions that I'm going to ask. And you mentioned U.S. and China, and you mentioned P5, but I'm going to concentrate on P3, on just the United States and China and Russia, because the other two seem to be having their own domestic difficulties, which are putting them a little bit on the side of this picture. There seems to be, Richard, there seems to be a unstoppable stride towards bipolarity and rivalry between the United States and China, and in this potential new Cold War, if you will, we're not there yet, but we're seeing the contours in the technological sector, and tomorrow it could be extended into other sectors. Um, about 50 years ago, President of the United States, Nixon, did something very unexpected. He traveled to China, and he made a great outreach to China, which ended up, in a way, driving a wedge between the two communist leaderships of Moscow and Beijing, and ultimately got China out of the Soviet orbit. Uh, Now, if the US-China rivalry is going to be the one that dominates the next years and decades, do you see the possibility of another American president doing or trying to do an inverse Nixon, in a sense that he or she travels to Moscow and gets Russia on the side of the United States in this future bipolar world?
Yeah, I don't see any prospect of that. Folks have floated the sort of reverse Kissinger idea for a while. But the question always becomes, what would Russia add? First of all, is it really the right way to think about this? Is there's this chessboard and you've got kind of three big pieces, and we'd rather have two on our side instead of one on the other, or whatever. What does Russia add to American power vis-a-vis China? And then what would we have to give up in terms of our principles or our interests in order to obtain Russian solidarity, right? And particularly when you have continued Russian interference in the American political system, and obviously the stuff going on in the Donbass and continued in Crimea and other things like that. You, I suppose, could imagine a bargain where all of that stuff gets reversed, but then you're still left with if you're sort of putting China on one side of the scale and the United States on the other, what does Russian power add to the United States side of the scale, other than maybe to somehow deny it to the Chinese side? Fundamentally, though, so I think there's a lot of questions about what we would actually gain in such a scenario. Then there's the domestic political barriers to this. I mean, if a president announced tomorrow that they wanted yet another reset with Russia, and they were going to let bygones be bygones in terms of election interference and things like that, the U.S. Congress would not support that. But then finally, there's this overarching question. Just like we're not in the world of 1945 anymore, we're also not in the world of 1971, 72, 73, where you look at the world and as like a risk board, and you have, this is also not Bismarck's world, where you have these great powers and you just want to get one on your side and not on the other. So I think it's a lot more complicated than that, and maybe that's a long way of saying I think that that's not in the cards.
Andrey, do you agree with Richard? Do you see the possibility of Russia in the future not necessarily ending up in the Chinese bloc, if you will, in the way that you mentioned before? And do you agree that that Russia doesn't have significant advantage in this way, as Richard suggests, or maybe that calculation should be somehow refined from your perspective?
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate Richard with the recent report on China that the center produced, Rising to the China Challenge. I think it's very well balanced and very comprehensive, very interesting document. I would recommend everybody to read it who is interested in China and the relations between the two countries. Second, in terms of Russia, I think that there is nothing really that the United States can offer Russia in the eyes of the Kremlin that can outweigh the current strategic partnership between Putin and Chairman Xi. I think it's clear, and I don't think it will change, at least as long as the two leaders are in charge. Both invested so much in this strategic partnership. I don't think that there is anything that is likely to change the situation. There'll be some wrinkles in this relationship, and there are some disagreements. Russia might be concerned about Chinese activities in Central Asia, and China might not be necessarily happy about the military cooperation between Moscow and New Delhi, but I don't foresee a real crisis in this relationship. But let me also refer to what Richard has mentioned earlier. I think the danger is not that China will defeat the United States and will become the only new superpower in the world. I think that the danger is that this rivalry creates opportunities for smaller, irresponsible players, be it rogue states or non-state actors, which might get loose. And we see what is going on in regions like the Middle East, for example. It's not an old struggle between great powers. We see pretty autonomous actors that have a major negative impact on regional and arguably global stability. So, in my opinion, it is difficult to fix relations between Beijing and Washington, but it is even more difficult to fix the system, which is much more complicated than it was even 20 years ago. And I'm afraid that right now we're simply wasting our time trying to play according to the old books, which will not help us in the future. So, in my view, it's not a choice between China and the United States for Russia. It's a choice between isolationism and integration. It's a choice between being alone, standing alone, or joining international alliances. In the end of the day, I'm sure that we will get to multilateralism, but probably it will be too late.
Vuk, if can
Well,
I
now
say
let me.
one? Can I
Sure,
add
absolutely.
something? So that last
Sure.
point is important because it's wrong to think about this as an American bloc and a Chinese bloc and countries, whether it's Russia or anything else, are a member of one bloc or the other, right? This is not the Cold War where you had a Soviet-led bloc and an American-led bloc. They didn't trade with each other very much. They didn't have very much interchange interpersonally. Or I mean, it was two different blocs led by two different countries that had two different ideologies, and they interpreted their interests differently, and they didn't have a lot of interchange between the two, right? Everything is different about that now, right? So, I mean, from an economic standpoint, is the United States in the American bloc or the Chinese bloc? Well, we're in both. I mean, China is one of our greatest trading partners, and no more that it would not work to go to Russia or any other country, maybe other than North Korea and Cambodia or something, to say choose America and not China. Give up your economic relationship with China in favor of some other economic and strategic relationship with the United States. And I don't think Xi Jinping would be any more successful trying to convince countries to give up their relationship with the United States in order to join some Chinese-led bloc. This is why it's competitive, but it's not a hermetically sealed difference where you're going to have these blocks that's led by another. And actually makes this entire thing more complicated because essentially countries are going to want an economic relationship with China, sometimes a security relationship with the United States and an economic relationship with the United States, sometimes a security relationship with China. It's complicated, and countries are going to hedge and do things in between. So from an American point of view, what we can't do is go to countries and say, you must choose us or them.
But do you think, but like, I'm sure you heard about this story. You were in Munich at the security conference a few months ago, and there was a leak from this meeting of Senator Lindsey Graham talking to the CEOs of German companies, and the topic of the conversation was Huawei. And Senator Graham was, and he's not the greatest hawk in America when it comes to China relations. There are people who are even more hawkish than him. But he said literally to the German CEOs, well, guys, if you end up having Huawei in your systems, you are going to have the United States as your enemy. I mean, how does this square with what you just said?
It doesn't square with what I just said very much. I mean, I like Senator. I've traveled all over the world with Senator Graham and gone to many countries and many Munich security conferences, and I agree with lots of his approaches. But I mean, if you're reporting accurately that Stark, I mean, this is one area where I disagree. For example, with the current administration's approach on Huawei, not because I think Huawei is less threatening in running 5G networks than they do. I think it is. But the question is, what are we putting on the table to incentivize countries to not bring Huawei into building out their systems? And one of the things the administration is doing is saying, well, we're going to cut off intelligence sharing with our allies if you do this. Well, I mean, that's nice, but at the end of the day, if they decide to choose Huawei, they're still our allies, and we would still have an interest in sharing intelligence with them. I mean, if Germany, I don't want to see Germany have Huawei build out its network, but if they do, we would still want Germany as an ally, not as an enemy. So, we've got to be I think, a little more nuanced in the way we're making these arguments and try to also provide alternatives, which is what countries are really interested in, not just laying down the law from an American perspective. So, but Huawei is a good example of countries that are caught between, price differentials, the fact that many of them would not like to have Huawei run their 5G networks, but they're worried about Chinese retaliation or access to the Chinese market or Chinese capital. And if we thought this was a big deal when the economy was doing well pre-coronavirus, just wait until Europe is in the middle of a profound recession. And, the foreign ministers and the defense ministers might suddenly be hawkish on China, but the finance ministers are going to say, wait a minute, hold on, we've got an economy to tend to. And how that plays out is going to be uncertain, but I think it's going to be harder from an American point of view on some of these issues than it was before.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This is fascinating. I'm going to now go to the topic that is certainly very contentious between your two countries, and this is the question of Ukraine. I know that we can spend hours talking about the Ukraine. So my question to Richard about Ukraine is going to be the following: imagine you can time travel back to 2014, to the winter of 2014, where when Maidan protests begun. And imagine you're being an advisor to the American president. What different do you think should America have done, if anything, now with the benefit of hindsight? Is there anything in the American way of handling the Ukraine crisis that you would do differently now with the benefit of hindsight?
Oh, that's a great question, and one that probably will launch a million dissertations and things like that over time. At the time, and it was hard to know what kind of communications were happening between Washington and Moscow behind the scenes. But at the time, I was not a big fan of the the administration publicly pledging, this kind of abstract costs that they would impose on Russia, and then Russia's a regional country, and it's a small kind of irritant, and it better watch out, or there'll be some broad, abstract, unspecified cost that we will impose, and we're going to create diplomatic off ramps. So as soon as they come to their senses, they can realize that this was a mistake and reverse it. I didn't think that that was, if such a thing was possible, to sort of have things stop short of the Crimea annexation, or certainly the war in Donbass, then I thought that trying to deal with this outside of the public sphere for a while could have at least heightened the chances of some kind of resolution. But that may be wrong, because I wasn't privy to the internal conversations were happening. So it may be the case that they were happening internally and it wouldn't have worked anyway. But that would have been a starting point to say, the United States and Russia were on opposite sides and remain on opposite sides of this. And so the number one starting point for anything like this is know thy adversary. How does the adversary interpret its interest in this? What is it trying to get out of it? And how do you sort of deal with that? So that would have been one starting place, I think.
So, simple question to you, Andrey. What is the Russian red line when it comes to Ukraine? And do you feel optimistic for the next couple of years? Can there be a détente between Russia and the West in the context of Ukraine? Is there a solution to it?
Well, as far as the red line is concerned, I think that the red line is mostly imaginary, in the sense that the Kremlin doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO, but it's very hard to imagine how Ukraine can join NATO in any foreseeable future. Of course, Ukraine might have special relations with the United States, but even talking of NATO, no, it's a little bit theological. For example, Ukraine is not a member to NATO, and Turkey is a member to NATO. What country has better relations with Russia these days? Apparently, it's Turkey, not Ukraine. But in my opinion, if you look at the situation today, everything except for the Crimean issue can be resolved between Kyiv and Moscow if there is political will, if there is enough flexibility, and if there is some courage. Crimea, in my opinion, should be put on the back burner. It's very difficult to imagine how a compromise can be achieved there. But as far as Donbass is concerned, Putin doesn't want to annex Donbass. He doesn't need it. Ukraine does not want to separate Donbass from the rest of the country. So it's about nitty-gritty details. It's about some mutual concessions. The point is that, in my opinion, neither side is ready to demonstrate flexibility, and basically we have a kind of new normal. And of course, there are very powerful institutional interests on both sides behind this new normal. And that creates a natural reluctance to change anything. And we see it right now after the December Normandy group meeting in Paris.
Well, thank you very much. I had a number of other questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to fast forward to our next section. And this is called like a blitz section. So I'm going to ask you to take a position, to take either a long position, which means you're optimistic, or take a short position, which means you are pessimistic with regard to a certain country or a certain international organization or alliance on the, let's say, 5 years horizon. So you can either go long or short. There's no other answer. So I'm essentially asking you to make a bet. It's going to be fun. You're gonna hear it. So I'm going to start by Richard, and I'm going to ask him: does he go long or short on the United Kingdom?
Short.
Andrey, the European Union.
Unfortunately, short.
Richard, Turkey.
Short. Unfortunately.
Andrey, Iran.
5 years, short.
Richard, China.
Long, much to our, which will complicate things, but long.
Andrey, India.
Hopefully long, though 5 years is too short a time to go long.
Richard, Ukraine.
Long.
Andrey, Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Short, sorry to say that.
Richard, Saudi Arabia.
Ooh. Short. That's a tough one, though. That's a tough
Andrey,
one.
Venezuela.
Short.
Richard, Serbia.
Short. Sorry.
Andrey, Serbia.
Since we are here, I would take long.
That's a, that's a good diplomatic
Richard.
answer.
Richard, Russia.
Short.
Andrey, the United States.
Long.
Wow, that is a fascinating exchange. I really enjoyed it. Guys, I'm sure that people afterwards are going to be, going through this and debating in our center as to what did you mean and what did you try to say and signal. But we're not going to go back. We're not going to go to the debate on this. I have 15 more minutes in this conversation, and I'd like to use it to ask you questions that was sent to us by our members and followers. Most of them are students. And some of those questions I find really, really fascinating. Now, please try to be short. These are not simple questions, but try to be short so that we can accomplish as many of them as possible. So I am going to start by asking Andrey a question from Olga from Subotica. It's a town in northern Serbia. And the question is, why did Russia decide to save Bashar al-Assad?
Well, I think that, first of all, in principle, Putin has always stood for quote-unquote legitimate leaders against revolutions, be it in Ukraine, in Libya, or in Syria. Second, it was a kind of pedagogical gesture to show to the West how one can fix problems in the region. And finally, of course, there were some clear economic regional interests at play as well.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Richard now a question that comes from Božidar from Belgrade. The question of territorial integrity is a big issue for both Ukraine and Serbia, in the view of Crimea and Kosovo. Both governments see this as a forced change in their borders and are strongly supported by the respective domestic public opinions. However, it doesn't look very likely that the situation may be reversed in both cases, at least not in the near future. So, what is your recommendation to Kiev and Belgrade? Should they stick to their constitutional positions or not?
Well, I think there's two different situations. One, I think the predicate for the circumstances that led to the eventual independence of Kosovo are very different, for example, than the circumstances that led to the annexation of Crimea. So, in the interest of shortness, I would say my advice to Serbia would be to make amends, or not make amends, but make friends with your neighbors, because the benefits of doing so, I think, could extend well into the future. With Ukraine, I don't think that it should or will give up its claim to Crimea, which was ultimately seized by force and borders territorially changed through a coercive referendum.
Now, this wasn't the question to Andrey. It was just a question for Richard. But I'm going to ask a question to Andrey. Same question to you.
Well, I think that in the end of the day, if there is a real commitment by people on a certain territory to decide on their future, it's very difficult to change it. And I think that though the situations in Kosovo and in Crimea can hardly be compared, I don't think that either Serbia or Ukraine can maintain these territories unless people who live in these territories are ready and are willing to join, to rejoin, or to stay within these states. So as far as Ukraine is concerned, if I were to advise people in Kiev, I would say the first thing you should do, you should convince people living in Crimea that it is in their best interest to remain Ukrainian citizens.
Well, thank you, Andrey. Another question is again to you. It's from Nenad from Banja Luka. And then it says Russia is capable of sending people to space and making great strides or havoc in cyber. Why is it that Russia still depends on oil and gas as the primary driver of its economy?
I think the question can be reversed because Russia is still addicted to energy and to oil. There is no incentive in Russia to invest more in high-end technologies and to turn its science research capacity into something that can be marketed, sold, and used in global markets. It's a very clear case of the Dutch disease. We see many talented Russians emigrating to the United States, to Europe, to other parts of the world, even to China. And I think that unless there is a change in the state policy, unless there is an emphasis on human capital rather than on natural resources, it would be very hard to incentivize people to turn their intellectual power into the boost to the Russian economy. That's as simple as that.
Well, thank you, Andrey. Now a question for Richard. It's a very interesting question. It comes from Igor from Kragujevac. So Igor says, is Donald Trump really the best that the conservative America has to offer? And is Joe Biden the best that the liberal America has to offer? And in case they're not, what's wrong with the American political system so that in the November elections we're going to have Donald Trump running against Joe Biden?
Well, if you ask, you're asking me. So, of course, the 330 million different opinions in the United States about precisely that question. So I can only give you my perspective. in 2016, I was one of the Republicans who came out in opposition to Donald Trump's candidacy after having worked on what ultimately turned out to be the ill-fated Jeb Bush and then Marco Rubio campaigns, who I thought were more authentic exponents of kind of the conservative internationalism foreign policy that has animated the Republicans for a very long time. I think there are elements of Donald Trump's approach that are conservative, and then there are elements that really aren't at all. I mean, at least as we have generally known it, his positions on trade, for example, or American exceptionalism, or some of these other kinds of things are not Reagan-esque, shall we say. So I think, but the point is that the Republican Party is not just a conservative party. It's we have two parties, and what Trump has done in part has remade the voting bloc so that it's more of a populist party. So some who were sort of dyed-in-the-wool conservatives don't support that move, and others who wouldn't have supported it as a conservative and support it for more populist reasons. On the Democratic side, they've had their great sorting out and things like that. And, from my point of view, Joe Biden looks like a strong candidate, particularly given that the last two standing were Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. And I think Bernie Sanders would not have been the kind of example of the liberal side of politics that most people would be looking for in November.
Well, thank you, Richard. Now back to Andrey. If the United States, this is a question, by the way, coming from Isidora. She is from Novi Sad. If the United States launches military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities in the future, and Tehran asks Moscow to help, similar to Damascus's ask for help some years ago, what do you think would be Russia's answer?
It's a hypothetical question, of course, but my answer would be that in this case, Moscow would render any possible assistance, including more military assistance, more assistance in the economic field. It would definitely raise this issue in the United Nations Security Council. It would try to mobilize its partners in the condemnation of the United States actions. But I don't think that Moscow will be in a position to interfere militarily in this situation. And that was exactly the way how Moscow responded to the Trump military strikes on the Assad infrastructure. He conducted two such strikes in 2017 and in 2018. However, if the United States strikes affect the Russian military infrastructure, then the response might be very different, and we might have an escalation, even an inadvertent escalation that nobody wants.
Now a question for both of you, for both Richard and Andrey, and it comes from Ivana. She is from Podgorica. Do you trust Turkey? Richard.
Trust but verify, as Ronald Reagan would say. There are allies that we trust more or less implicitly. The Australians, the British, and then there are allies that we trust most of the time. And then there's allies like Turkey that you got to keep both eyes on Turkey. We'd rather have them as, I believe we'd rather have them as formal allies inside NATO than the alternative. But everything these days is trust but verify. No trust without verification.
Andrey, do you trust Turkey?
Well, I trust Turkey completely. I have many friends in Istanbul and in Ankara. I trust them. I like the Turkish people. But as far as the Turkish leadership is concerned, I wouldn't buy a used car from Mr. Erdogan, that's for sure.
That is a fascinating answer. That's a fascinating answer. I'm sure this answer is going to be the biggest hit in this conversation, amongst the biggest hits for sure. So I'm going to ask you another question. This question comes from Stefan, and he is from Niš. That's for Andrey. What is the single biggest mistake of Russia's foreign policy in this century?
I think there are two mistakes. The first mistake is that Russia failed to find a proper accommodation with the West, especially with its Western partners in Europe, meaning a special relationship with the European Union in the first place, and second, some kind of special arrangement with the NATO alliance. And the second mistake was that Russia failed to create a belt of friendly nations along its borders. I think these were two major missions, that had to be accomplished and that had to be turned into top priorities of the Russian Federation. But unfortunately, Russia, for a variety of reasons, couldn't accomplish any of them.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Andrey. That was very honest, very thoughtful. Thank you for that. The last question in this show goes for Richard, and the question is from Slobodan. He lives in Munich. He's a Serbian, but he lives in Munich. So his question is: if you were to write a memo containing one recommendation for the American president that is going to take office in January 2021, and you are supposed to put this into an envelope for this to be opened by the new president in January 2021, what would you write today? One single piece of advice.
The piece of advice would be seize the opportunity that has presented itself in crisis. We were speaking at the beginning of this conversation about all the bad effects that we expect from coronavirus, the lack of international cooperation, the deleterious effect this has on various institutions and things like that. But ultimately, these are human constructions, and it doesn't have to be that way. And what I see in these institutions, as I was saying earlier, is in the absence of America playing a leading role, even just to set the agenda and try to bring other countries around in some kind of common cause, you don't get another country stepping up to do that in ways that we would like or in ways that we don't like. Instead, you just see an absence of that. And so there is still a strong demand signal for the United States to lead, and it's become trite to talk about American leadership and the lack thereof, but I think there is something real to it. And that's the opportunity that presents itself coming out of this crisis to try to build something better for the world in an enlightened self-interest kind of way than the world we had going into the crisis. It's no easy task, but we would be crazy to let this global trauma pass without at least trying to construct something better in its place.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Andrey. Thank you both. Thank you, gentlemen, for doing this, for taking the time. It was a fascinating exchange. It was a humbling thing for a Serbian think tank to be a host of two heavyweights of foreign policy thought from Washington and from Moscow. Your respective institutions are no doubt leading think tanks in your capitals and the wider world. It's a great honor to be your host again, and I use this opportunity to invite you to Belgrade after the flights resume. For Richard to fly from DC and from Andrey to fly in from Moscow and to do the same thing physically in Belgrade later this year or next year or wherever the opportunity arises. Thank you, gentlemen.
I can't wait. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Vuk, and
Thank
good luck.
you.
Stay
Thanks
well.
a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Same to you guys.
Bye.
All the best. Bye.
Thank you, Richard. Take care.
Bye. Good.